The security camera footage at St. Jude's Medical Center captured the exact moment the piece shattered. 1 second it was a routine Friday night. The next, a 300-pound security guard was thrown across the waiting room like a rag doll. The aggressor, a 7-foot-tall giant, screaming in a language of pure rage, tearing through the ER doors like they were made of paper. Doctors froze. Police were minutes away. Patients were screaming. The only thing standing between this unstoppable force and a room full of vulnerable people was Elle, a 5'2" rookie nurse on her 3rd shift. Everyone thought she was going to die. They were wrong. Here is the true story of how the smallest person in the room became its biggest hero. The fluorescent lights of the emergency room at St. Jude's Medical Center in downtown Seattle hummed with that particular frequency that only healthcare workers seem to hear, a low electric buzz that signals the calm before a catastrophic storm. It was 10:15 p.m. on a Friday. In the medical world, they call this the witching hour. The precise moment when the happy hour drunks transition into the overdose cases and the domestic disputes start spilling out of living rooms and into the trauma bay. Elle Bennett adjusted her scrub top, pulling it down nervously. It was slightly too big for her. Standing at just 5'2", with a frame that looked like a strong wind could knock it over. Elle didn't look like she belonged in the chaotic trenches of a level 1 trauma center. She looked like a librarian who had taken a wrong turn. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a ponytail that bobbed slightly as she checked the vitals monitor for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. "Stop fidgeting, Bennett. You're making the patients nervous." The voice cut through the air like a scalpel. It belonged to Brenda Miller, the charge nurse. Brenda was a legend at St. Jude's, a 50-year-old veteran who had survived the crack epidemic of the 80s, the gang wars of the 90s, and 3 hospital mergers. She had arms like a dock worker and a patient's threshold of 0. To Brenda, Elle was just another traveler, a temporary nurse filling a gap likely to wash out before her contract was up. "Sorry, Brenda," Elle murmured, keeping her eyes on the chart. "Just double-checking Mr. Henderson's O2 saturation. It's dipping slightly." "It's dipping because he's 90 years old, and he's holding his breath every time you hover over him," Brenda snapped, not looking up from her computer. "Go check bed 4. Dr. Reynolds needs a catheter set up, and don't mess it up like the last rookie." Elle swallowed her pride and nodded. She knew what they whispered about her in the break room. She had heard Dr. Reynolds, the arrogant attending physician with the jawline of a movie star, and the ego to match laughing with the residents earlier that evening. "She looks like a high school volunteer," Reynolds had joked. "If a code grey comes in, what's she going to do?" "Politely ask the meth head to sit down. I give her 2 weeks." They didn't know Ella. They didn't know where she had been for the last 5 years, or why her hands, though small, were steadier than any surgeon's in the building. They saw the rookie tag on her badge and the way she kept her head down, and they assumed she was weak. They were making the classic mistake, confusing silence for submission. The ER doors whooshed open, admitting a gust of cold, rainy Seattle air, and 2 paramedics wheeling in a stretcher. "Overdose female, mid-20s, one of the paramedics shouted, his voice tight. "Unresponsive but breathing. BP is 90/60. The room snapped into action. Dr. Reynolds strode forward, barking orders. "Get her to trauma 2. Brenda, get a line started. Bennett, stay out of the way." Ella stepped back against the wall, her hands clasped behind her back. She watched the dance, the chaotic, beautiful choreography of saving a life. She noted that Reynolds was good, his movements precise, but he was too loud. He fed off the adrenaline, ramping up the tension in the room, rather than diffusing it. Brenda was the anchor, moving with heavy, sure steps. But Ella's eyes drifted away from the trauma bay. She looked toward the main sliding glass doors of the ambulance bay. Something felt wrong. It wasn't a sound. It was a vibration. A low thrumming that seemed to shake the floor tiles beneath her sneakers. She watched the security guard, a burly man named Big Mike Cogan, look up from his desk. Mike was 6'4", a former defensive lineman for the University of Washington. He was the hospital's first line of defense, a man who had tackled knife-wielding psych patients without breaking a sweat. Elle saw Mike's face change. The boredom vanished, replaced by confusion, and then a flicker of genuine fear. "Unit 1 to dispatch," Mike said into his radio, his voice carrying across the waiting room. I don't know what I've got. There's a vehicle moving fast in the ambulance lane. It's not an ambulance." Elle stepped away from the wall, her instincts flaring. "Brenda," she said, her voice low, but cutting through the noise of the trauma bay. "Not now, Bennett," Brenda yelled, trying to find a vein on the overdose patient. "Brenda, look at the monitors," Elle said, pointing not to the medical screens, but to the security feed above the nurse's station. On the grainy black-and-white screen, a black SUV had just smashed through the metal bollards at the entrance of the ambulance bay. Steam was pouring from its radiator. The driver's side door was kicked open, literally kicked, hanging off its hinges. And then he stepped out. Even on the small screen, the man was impossible to comprehend. He was massive. He wore a torn grey hoodie that strained against muscles that looked like hydraulic pistons. He stood in the pouring rain, his head tilted back, letting the water wash over a face contorted in a scream that the camera couldn't capture, but the soul could feel. "Who is that?" Dr. Reynolds asked, pausing for a split second as he looked up at the screen. "That," Elle whispered, her eyes narrowing, "is a problem." The man on the screen didn't walk toward the ER doors. He charged. He moved with a terrifying speed for a man of his size. He covered the 20 yards from the SUV to the glass doors in seconds. Big Mike stood up his hand, going to the taser on his belt. "Sir, stop right there. This is a restricted area." The automatic doors didn't open fast enough. The man didn't wait. He lowered his shoulder and slammed into the tempered glass. Crash! The sound was like a gunshot. The safety glass shattered into a million diamonds raining down onto the linoleum. The entire ER went silent. The beeping of the heart monitors seemed to grow deafeningly loud. Through the broken frame stepped the intruder. In person, he was even bigger than on the screen. He had to be 7 feet tall. His skin was flushed, a deep, violent red veins bulging from his neck like thick cords. His eyes were jet, the pupils blown out so fully that his eyes looked like black holes. He was frothing slightly at the mouth. This wasn't just a drunk. This wasn't just a junkie. This was excited delirium syndrome, a state of extreme agitation where the body's adrenaline reserves dump all at once, granting the person hysterical strength and imperviousness to pain. "I said freeze!" Big Mike shouted, stepping into the center of the hallway, leveling his taser. The giant didn't even look at Mike. He looked through him. He let out a roar that shook the dust from the ceiling tiles. "Where is she?" The giant screamed, his voice a gravelly distortion of human speech. "Give her to me." "Last warning," Mike yelled. He fired the taser. The 2 prongs hit the giant square in the chest. The wires went taut. The electrical discharge, 50,000 volts, designed to drop a grown man, instantly crackled through the air. The giant looked down at the wires in his chest. He didn't convulse. He didn't fall. He simply reached up, grabbed the wires with a massive hand, and ripped the barbs out of his own flesh as if he were plucking a stray hair. Blood trickled down his grey hoodie. He smiled, a broken, bloody smile. "Mike, run," Elle whispered. The giant lanner of Samost, Big Mike, a man who weighed 260 pounds, braced for input. It didn't matter. The giant backhanded him. It was a casual, dismissive motion like swatting a fly. Mike's feet left the ground. He flew backward airborne for a terrifying 2 seconds before smashing into the triage desk, shattering the computer monitors and crumpling to the floor unconscious. Screams erupted. Patients scrambled off gurneys, tripping over IV lines. Dr. Reynolds, the man who had mocked Elle's toughness just an hour ago, was backing away, his face pale as a sheet holding a clipboard like a shield. "Security code, grey code, silver. Get the police!" Brenda screamed, grabbing the phone, her hands shaking for the first time in 20 years. The giant stood in the center of the wreckage, breathing heavily, scanning the room. His eyes locked onto the trauma 2 bay, where the young female overdose patient lay. "Elle!" he bellowed. He wasn't calling for the nurse. He was calling for the patient. And Nurse Elle Bennett, the rookie who was supposed to wash out in 2 weeks, realized 2 things instantly. First, this monster was here to kill that girl. Second, nobody else in this room could stop him. Ella didn't retreat. While Dr. Reynolds hid behind a crash cart and Brenda dialed 911, Elle quietly reached into her pocket and unclipped her pen light. She took a deep breath, slowing her heart rate down through sheer force of will. She took 1 step forward, placing herself directly in the path of the 7-foot titan. "Hey!" she shouted, her voice surprisingly deep, projecting from her diaphragm. The giant turned his head, looking down at the tiny woman in the oversized scrubs. He looked confused, like a tank wondering why a flower was blocking its path. "Get out of my way, little girl," the giant growled, stepping toward her. The ground shook with his footfall. Ella didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She stood her ground 5'2" against 7 feet of homicidal rage. "I can't do that," Elle said, her voice steady. The giant raised a fist the size of a cinder block. The fist that descended toward Elle Bennett's head was heavy enough to crack a skull like an eggshell. It moved with the velocity of a wrecking ball. Dr. Reynolds, peeking out from behind the crash cart, squeezed his eyes shut. He didn't want to see the new nurse die. But the sound of impact never came. At the very last fraction of a second, Elle didn't back away. She stepped in. It was a move that defied every survival instinct a human being possesses. When a monster swings at you, you run away. But Ella stepped into the giant's guard, dipping her left shoulder. The massive fist whistled past her ear, the wind of it blowing a loose strand of hair across her face. She was now inside his reach, close enough to smell the sour stench of old sweat metallic blood and the chemical tang of methamphetamine pouring off him. Ella didn't pause to admire her dodge. Her movement was fluid, practiced, and terrifyingly precise. As she pivoted on her back foot, her right elbow shot upward like a piston. It connected squarely with the giant solar plexus, a bundle of nerves just below the sternum. Thwack! It was a solid hit, a hit that would have dropped a normal man to his knees, gasping for air. The giant merely grunted. He stumbled back half a step, looking down at his chest in confusion. The drugs coursing through his veins were acting as a suit of armor, dulling the pain signals before they could reach his brain. "You hit me," the giant rumbled. The confusion in his eyes was replaced by a cold, homicidal focus. "You little gnat." "Brenda," Elle yelled, not taking her eyes off the Titan. "Clear the trauma bay. Get the patient out the back. Now." "But," Brenda stammered, paralyzed by the absurdity of the scene. "Move," Elle barked. It wasn't the voice of a subordinate. It was the voice of a commander. Brenda snapped out of her trance. She grabbed the gurney of the overdose patient, the girl the giant had called Elle, and began wheeling her backward toward the double doors leading to radiology. The giant roared. He saw his prize slipping away. He lunged forward, ignoring Elle, reaching out with a hand the size of a shovel to grab the railing of the gurney. He never made it. Elle Bennett moved again. This time, she didn't strike. She intercepted. As the giant reached out, Ella grabbed his wrist. To an observer, it looked laughable, her tiny, pale hand wrapping around a wrist as thick as a telephone pole. But Ella didn't try to hold him back. She knew physics. She knew she couldn't stop a freight train, but she could derail it. She pulled with his momentum, dropping her center of gravity and extending her leg across his path. It was a textbook judo throw, seoi nage, adapted for a size disparity that shouldn't have been possible. She twisted her hips using his own forward velocity against him. For a split second, the laws of gravity seemed to suspend. The 7-foot giant's feet left the floor. He rotated in the air, a look of pure shock on his blood-streaked face. Boom! He hit the linoleum floor with the force of a car crash. The ground shook so hard that instruments on the sterile trays rattled. Dr. Reynolds's jaw dropped. He stood up from behind the crash cart, forgetting his fear for a moment. Holy! Ella didn't celebrate. She didn't pose. She knew better. She knew that with excited delirium, the body doesn't register trauma. A throw like that would break a normal man's ribs. For this guy, it was just an annoyance. Stay down, Elle ordered, backing away. Her hands raised in a defensive posture that looked strikingly similar to Krav Maga. The giant didn't stay down. He rolled over, a guttural growl erupting from his throat. He pushed himself up his nose, now bleeding freely from the impact. He looked at Ella, not with anger anymore, but with a predator's curiosity. He reached down and ripped a bolted-down metal IV pole right out of the floor. The screws shrieked as they were torn from the concrete. He held the 6-foot metal pole like a baseball bat. Okay, Elle whispered to herself, her eyes scanning the room for options. Plan B. Who are you? Dr. Reynolds shouted, his voice cracking. What are you doing? Doctor, shut up and get behind the blast doors, Elle yelled without looking at him. The giant swung the IV pole. He was aiming for Elle's head. She ducked, but not fast enough to clear it completely. The heavy metal base of the pole clipped her shoulder. Crack! Ella cried out, stumbling sideways. The pain was blinding. Her left arm went numb instantly. She hit the wall, sliding down, gasping for breath. Got you, the giant sneered. He raised the pole for a killing blow. Elle looked up. Her vision was swimming. She saw the metal pole rising. She saw the fluorescent lights flickering. She saw the terrified faces of the nurses huddled by the nurses' station. She knew she couldn't take another hit. If that pole connected with her skull, she was dead. And if she died, the girl on the gurney died. And probably Brenda, too. Ella's hand fell to her side, brushing against the pockets of her oversized scrubs. Her fingers grazed something hard and plastic. The trauma shears.